You saw the title, let's just skip the intro and get right into the data, my friends, starting with Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. We're looking at 8 ice climbers here. This is a pretty common benchmark for the system, and as you can see, it's a little bit too much for the Switch. It's not hitting its 60 FPS. However, we switch over to the we go to the Switch 2, and immediately our frame rate problems are solved. It is locked at 60 with some headroom to spare. And this demonstrates the first thing that the Switch 2 can do. The Switch 2 will basically hit whatever the pre-programmed cap was for frame rate in Switch 1 games. If the game had frame rate issues on Switch, they are almost always completely resolved on Switch 2, and I say almost always on purpose. We'll talk about that a bit later. Another great example of this is Rune Factory 5, which was absolutely hammered by fans for having abysmal performance, despite also having poor visuals due to the dynamic resolution scaling essentially rendering the game a blurry mess, at least in the more demanding areas. Well, now we've got a version that's literally locked at 30 and no longer needs to utilize dynamic resolution scaling to stay there. There's still a lot of dithering and noise on the edges of things, don't get me wrong, but this functionally fixes Rune Factory 5 and makes it a playable game again. This is also a huge beneficiary of one of the other things that the Switch 2 can do, which is massively improve load times. I don't have footage of it, but it about cuts things in half, sometimes better, on games with long loading sequences. Since I brought up resolution, let's take a look at Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. This whole series is one of the very best on the entire console, but it's also famous for having beautiful worlds that are scaled back in resolution with dynamic resolution scaling all the way down to 504p in docked mode. And you can see it's looking pretty soft here on Switch. Jumping over to Switch 2, it's now capped at the maximum, which is 720p, and it stays there. Now 720p is not 1080p, and it's a far cry from 4K, so it still looks a little soft, and it has a little bit of artifacting due to things like anti-aliasing and whatnot, but clearly a drastic improvement here. I think you get a good idea of the difference if you zoom in on the character models a bit. It's just a lot sharper on Switch 2. And that brings us to the next thing that the Switch 2 can do, which is functionally lock Switch games to whatever their max resolution was, functionally removing all dynamic resolution scaling. And it's able to achieve this through its massively more powerful and technically capable GPU. All good news so far, but let's take a quick peek back at that Xenoblade footage, because the eagle-eyed among you probably picked up on something interesting. The Switch 1 version uses that dynamic resolution scaling to maintain a locked 30 FPS. Bouncing over to the Switch 2, we get a locked 720p resolution, but the same steady 30 FPS. And this brings us to the first thing that the Switch 2 can't do, which is remove the pre-programmed caps that the developers put in place for the Switch 1 hardware. The Switch 2 is absolutely capable of 1080p resolution, 60 FPS, with higher graphical settings all the time. But because the Switch 1 ceiling is 720p resolution at 30 FPS, that's the best we're ever gonna get. That is, of course, until they release a Switch 2 version of the game that unlocks those numbers and scales things up for the console. Now before we take a look at our last positive, probably the biggest one for me, let's get this list back up and take a look at a couple more things the Switch 2 can't do, starting with fixing poor optimization in games. And Dragon Quest Builders 2 is a really good example of how much more of an upgrade the Switch 2's GPU is relative to Switch 1 than the CPU or processor was. This title is heavily CPU bound, and as such does not come close to hitting its 60 FPS cap. Then if we jump over to Switch 2, we'll see that even in this introductory section, the Switch 2 is still not maintaining 60 FPS at all times. And the multiplayer mode is where things get substantially worse still. This footage here is from Modern Vintage Gamer, and you can see on Switch 1 in multiplayer, you're dropping into the single digits at times. It's absolutely unplayable. And then on Switch 2, it's drastically improved, right? It's over doubled, but it's still in the low 20s a lot of the time. Being a handheld console by design means some cuts need to be made for thermal management and battery life purposes, and the admittedly very rare sandbox and simulation games that max out the CPU are where you see this limitation, though it is still drastically better than Switch 1, of course. Now, one more thing that the Switch 2 can't do before we move on to my biggest reason for buying one in the first place, and spoilers, you already know what it is if you watched my other Switch 2 video. The Switch 2 cannot fix broken games. It's on the developers to patch those to make sure they work on the hardware. One example that seems to still be an issue is Borderlands 3. Here's a video from a Reddit user showing their experience playing it. I think most of the other big name titles that had issues have all been patched and fixed now, but just know there's that slim possibility that you may run into some fringe title that has an issue. And now we move on to the final thing that the Switch 2 can do, my personal reason for getting the console in the first place, and that's a little update that Nintendo did a couple months ago now, introducing a new feature quietly into the settings called Handheld Mode Boost. This allows the Switch 2 to play Switch 1 games as if they were docked, even when you're playing handheld. And to illustrate what a difference this makes, we're going to take another look at Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. Now, if you thought the resolution was a little rough before, take a look at handheld mode on the Switch 1, where the cap is 540p, but it often scales all the way down to 378p. That's CRT territory. Meanwhile, comparatively on the Switch 2, and granted it's hard to capture the handheld footage, I'm doing the best I can here, but it will scale all the way up to the same 720p that we saw in docked mode earlier. Now this is a big deal, as you might imagine, as before this update, before this mode existed, the Switch 2 was trying to stretch the previous cap of 540p up to 1080p, and that's 1/4 the pixel count, so it looked really rough. But now in handheld mode, we get an image that's just as sharp as docked mode and substantially better than the Switch 1, whether docked or in handheld. As someone that plays my Switch in handheld mode probably 95 to 98% of the time, realistically speaking, this was the single biggest selling point for me. Alright, so the final verdict, I'm going to put the full list up on screen. While the Switch 2 is not perfect, it's basically a soft remaster for every single Switch 1 game that you're playing on the console, and very worth it if what you're looking for is an upgraded experience for your existing Switch 1 library. Outside of a select few titles that basically see no improvement because they weren't demanding in the first place, or the select few titles that I mentioned that have issues, every single other Switch 1 title sees a large improvement playing on the Switch 2's hardware, with handheld boost mode now allowing you to take advantage of the increased power of that newer console on the go, which is a really nice bonus. Now, does that mean that you should run out and buy a Switch 2 if you have Switch 1 games? Well, that's completely up to you, but I just did a video on that topic, so make sure you check that out. I'll throw that up on screen here, as well as a list of some Switch games that you should check out for your console, whether you have a Switch 1 or Switch 2. If you made it this far, I appreciate you sticking around, and thanks for stopping by.